For 200 years, every spice that touched a European table, every silk thread woven into a royal gown, every gem that adorned a crown, all of it passed through one set of hands. The Ottoman Empire didn't just control land. They controlled the world's wallet. But the same chokehold that made them the richest power on earth would become the noose that strangled them. What happens when your greatest strength becomes your fatal weakness? In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, the jewel between Europe and Asia. The Ottomans didn't just capture a city. They seized the intersection of civilization itself. For the next 2 centuries, they would tax, regulate, and profit from nearly every trade route connecting east to west. This is the story of how controlling the world's commerce built the richest empire of its age, and how that same control drove European powers to find new paths that would leave the Ottomans isolated, broke, and obsolete. Before the Ottomans took Constantinople, global trade was fragmented but stable. European merchants paid tolls to various kingdoms, but no single power monopolized the flow. Gold and silver moved predictably. Prices for Eastern goods, pepper, cinnamon, silk, were high but steady. After 1453, everything changed. The Ottomans now controlled the Bosphorus Strait, the gateway between the Black Sea and Mediterranean. They held the Red Sea ports. They commanded the Persian Gulf access points. This wasn't just political control, it was economic strangulation. European kingdoms suddenly faced a new reality. Every luxury good from the East now came with Ottoman taxes attached. Profit margins for European merchants shrank. Prices for consumers soared. Meanwhile, Ottoman treasuries swelled with customs revenue that required no production, no farming, no manufacturing, just the privilege of geography. The system seemed perfect for the Ottomans. But invisible pressure was building. European rulers were watching their wealth drain eastward. Their merchants were desperate. Their treasuries were hungry. And desperation breeds innovation. When Mehmed's cannons finally broke through Constantinople's walls on May 29th, the Byzantine Empire died. But something bigger was born, a trade empire. The Ottomans immediately restructured the city's port taxes. They raised tariffs on goods passing through. They demanded payment in gold, silver, or goods. Within 5 years, Ottoman customs revenue tripled. Historical records confirm this dramatic increase. European merchants had no choice but to pay. There was no other route. In 1517, Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt and took control of Mecca and Medina. This wasn't just about religion. Egypt meant control of Red Sea trade routes, the southern gateway for spices from India and Southeast Asia. Now the Ottomans controlled both the northern route through Constantinople and the southern route through Egypt. The spice trade alone generated 30% of Ottoman customs revenue by 1520. Pepper, which grew in India, cost European buyers 4 times what it cost Indian merchants. The difference? Ottoman middlemen taking their cut at every port. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled during the empire's peak wealth. Ottoman records show customs revenue reached 12 million gold ducats annually, equivalent to roughly $2 billion today in purchasing power. The capital, now called Istanbul, became the world's richest city. Every day, hundreds of ships docked. Silks from China, gems from India, coffee from Yemen, furs from Russia, all passed through Ottoman hands. The empire didn't need to manufacture anything. They just collected tolls. But European kingdoms were bleeding money. Portugal's treasury spent 40% of its annual revenue buying Eastern goods through Ottoman middlemen. Venice, once Europe's trade hub, saw its merchant fleet shrink by half between 1450 and 1550. Spain's silver mines worked overtime just to keep up with trade payments flowing east. What happens when one empire controls everyone else's shopping list? In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. It was a failed expedition in one sense. He turned back before reaching India. But he proved something crucial. There was a way around the Ottoman monopoly. The Portuguese king, John II, immediately funded more voyages. The economics were simple. If they could reach India directly by sea, they'd cut out all Ottoman middlemen. A pound of pepper that cost 20 gold ducats in Venice might cost only 3 ducats at the source. Then came the voyage that changed everything. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed what Diaz started. His fleet of 4 ships sailed around Africa and landed in Calicut, India. For the first time in history, Europeans could buy spices directly from Asian merchants without paying a single Ottoman toll. Da Gama's first voyage returned with spices worth 60 times the expedition's cost. Portuguese merchants could now sell pepper in Europe for half the Ottoman-controlled price and still make massive profits. The Ottoman treasury noticed immediately. Within 10 years, customs revenue from the spice trade dropped 25%. Between 1519 and 1522, Ferdinand Magellan sailed west, trying to reach Asia by circling the globe. Though Magellan died during the voyage, his fleet completed the journey. Spain now had its own route to the Spice Islands, completely bypassing Ottoman territory. The age of exploration wasn't about adventure or curiosity. It was about money. European powers spent fortunes on dangerous expeditions for one reason: to escape paying Ottoman taxes. In 1545, Spanish conquistadors discovered massive silver deposits in Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia. This changed everything. For centuries, European trade with the East had been limited by how much gold and silver they could gather. Now, Spanish ships brought hundreds of tons of silver back to Europe every year. But this silver didn't stay in Europe. It flooded east, directly to Asia through the new Portuguese and Spanish routes. European merchants could now afford to buy more Asian goods than ever. And none of it passed through Ottoman hands. The Ottoman Empire faced a cruel irony. Global trade was growing explosively, but they were cut out of it. Between 1500 and 1600, global trade volume tripled. Ottoman participation in that trade fell by half. Ottoman customs revenue continued declining. By 1650, income from trade taxes had fallen to 40% of what it was in 1520. The empire tried raising tax rates to compensate, but higher taxes just pushed more merchants to use alternative routes. The empire's gold and silver reserves shrank. They couldn't afford to maintain their massive military. They couldn't pay government officials properly. Corruption spread as underpaid bureaucrats took bribes. The entire system started crumbling, all because the trade routes that built them now belonged to their rivals. In 1683, the Ottoman siege of Vienna failed. This military defeat marked the beginning of territorial decline. But the economic decline had started 150 years earlier, the moment Da Gama reached India. The empire had been living on borrowed time, using its still formidable size and military to mask the fact that its economic foundation had rotted away. By 1700, the Ottomans controlled the same territory as 1500, but they were no longer the center of world trade. They'd become a regional power, living in the shadow of their former wealth. Ottoman treasury records, preserved in Istanbul's archives, show precise customs revenue figures from major ports. These records indicate Constantinople's customs revenue peaked around 1520, declining dramatically by 1600. The Casa de India in Lisbon kept detailed accounts of all spice shipments from Asia. These records show spice imports from direct Asian trade grew from zero in 1497 to over 2,000 tons annually by 1550. Spanish colonial records tracked silver shipments from the Americas with obsessive detail for tax purposes. Multiple historians have reconstructed global trade volumes using port records, shipping manifests, and merchant accounts from Venice, Genoa, Lisbon, Istanbul, and Amsterdam. While exact figures vary, all sources confirm the basic pattern. Global trade expanded dramatically while Ottoman participation contracted. Some historians argue Ottoman economic decline was less dramatic than often portrayed. They point out the empire remained wealthy and powerful into the 18th century. Ottoman GDP may have grown in absolute terms, even as trade revenue fell. Internal trade and agriculture still generated substantial wealth. This view is fair. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse overnight, but the relative decline is undeniable. In 1500, the Ottomans controlled the flow of global luxury goods. By 1700, they were bypassed by European trade networks. They went from being the middleman who took a cut of everything to being cut out entirely. Some scholars emphasize internal factors over trade routes. They cite tax farming corruption, military expansion costs, and political instability. According to this view, the empire's problems stemmed from bad governance, not geography. Both factors mattered, but the evidence suggests trade route loss came first, and made everything else worse. When customs revenue dropped, the government couldn't pay officials properly. When they couldn't pay officials, corruption spread. When corruption spread, tax collection became inefficient. The loss of trade revenue triggered a cascade of failures. Could the Ottomans have prevented this? Some historians speculate they should have built their own ocean-going fleet and competed for Asian trade directly. The empire did attempt Indian Ocean expeditions in the early 1500s, but never sustained them. Others argue geography doomed them regardless. Once ocean routes were discovered, any land-based empire would lose its middleman advantage. The Ottomans were trapped by the same geography that initially empowered them. The collapse of Ottoman trade dominance didn't kill people directly, but it destroyed livelihoods across 2 continents. In Istanbul, merchant families who'd grown wealthy over 3 generations watched their businesses evaporate. Portuguese and Spanish ships now carried the spices and silks that once filled their warehouses. Shops closed. Workers lost jobs. Smaller port cities suffered worse. Towns along the Red Sea and Persian Gulf that had thrived on transit trade simply dried up. There was no factory work to fall back on, no alternative industries. Trade had been everything. When trade left, so did survival. The human cost extended beyond borders. European merchants who'd built their businesses around Ottoman trade routes suddenly found their expertise obsolete. Venetian traders who spoke Turkish and knew Istanbul's markets couldn't adapt to direct Asian trade, requiring different languages, different routes, different relationships. For ordinary people in the Ottoman Empire, the slow economic decline meant something simple and devastating. Less money in circulation, fewer jobs, higher prices, lower wages. The government raised taxes to compensate for lost customs revenue, squeezing farmers and artisans. Savings became worthless as the currency weakened. Trust in institutions crumbled. This wasn't a sudden disaster like a plague or invasion. It was a slow suffocation that took generations, that made it harder to identify, harder to resist, and harder to reverse. The Ottoman experience teaches us something fundamental about economics. Middleman profits depend on scarcity. If you control the only bridge across a river, you can charge tolls. But if someone builds another bridge, your tolls become optional. The Ottomans controlled geography, not production. They didn't grow spices. They didn't weave silk. They just controlled the routes between producers and consumers. This made their wealth vulnerable to any innovation that created new routes. And innovation is impossible to stop. Here's the pattern. When one power monopolizes something valuable, rivals pour resources into finding alternatives. The Ottoman trade monopoly directly funded the age of exploration. Portugal and Spain spent fortunes on risky voyages because the potential reward, breaking the Ottoman monopoly, was enormous. Think of it like this. Imagine one company controlled all the roads and charged tolls. Other companies would invest in helicopters, boats, tunnels, anything to bypass those tolls. The Ottomans controlled the roads. Europeans built the ships. The silver flood from the Americas illustrates another principle. Money flows toward goods, not toward middlemen. When European powers got more silver, they spent it directly with Asian producers. They didn't need to go through Ottoman middlemen anymore. The Ottomans couldn't compete because they didn't produce what buyers wanted. They only controlled access. The Ottomans faced what economists call a geographic rent situation. They earned money from location, not innovation or production. This type of wealth is inherently fragile because geography is fixed, but routes are flexible. Once new routes opened, Ottoman geography became irrelevant. It's like owning the best horse stable in town. You're rich until cars are invented. The stable doesn't become worthless overnight, but its value steadily declines as everyone switches to the new technology. The Ottomans owned the stable. Europeans invented the car. By depending so heavily on trade taxes, the Ottoman government created a vulnerability. When that revenue declined, everything else suffered: military, administration, infrastructure. Diversified economies can lose one sector and survive. Single-source economies collapse when that source dries up. The lesson applies beyond empires. Any economy or business that depends on one revenue stream faces existential risk if that stream gets disrupted. Oil-dependent nations know this. Company towns know this. The Ottomans learned it the hard way. The Ottoman story reveals a crucial distinction in economics. Controlling something valuable is not the same as creating something valuable. Control can be circumvented. Creation cannot. The Ottomans controlled access but created little. When Europeans found new access routes, Ottoman control became worthless. If the Ottomans had instead focused on manufacturing, agriculture, or innovation, creating value rather than gatekeeping it, they would have been far more resilient. Monopolies generate enormous short-term profits, but guarantee long-term disruption. The bigger the monopoly profit, the bigger the incentive for others to innovate around it. The Ottomans' massive trade profits directly funded the expeditions that destroyed those profits. They essentially paid for their own replacement. Geography can make you rich, but only until technology changes. The Ottomans were in the right place until ocean navigation improved, and the right place shifted from land routes to sea routes. This pattern repeats throughout history. Canals make certain cities rich until railroads bypass them. Railroads create boom towns until highways do the same. The Suez Canal made Egypt strategically vital until air freight reduced its importance. The takeaway: advantages based on fixed geography are temporary. Advantages based on knowledge, innovation, and production are durable. When customs revenue began falling, the Ottoman government had few alternatives. They hadn't invested in manufacturing. They hadn't built a merchant fleet to compete. They'd grown comfortable collecting tolls. When those tolls disappeared, the treasury was exposed. Modern economists call this the resource curse, when one extremely profitable sector makes you neglect everything else. For the Ottomans, trade taxes were so profitable they never developed other industries. When trade shifted, they had nothing to fall back on. The Ottoman Empire was like a shopkeeper who charged high prices because they owned the only store in town. For 2 centuries, everyone paid. Then customers built a new road, opened competing stores, and the original shopkeeper went broke. They'd been rich not because they offered good value, but because they offered the only option. And in economics, only option never lasts forever. Here's what we know for certain. The Ottomans controlled the world's most important trade routes for 200 years. European powers spent fortunes finding alternatives. When they succeeded, Ottoman customs revenue collapsed. The empire's wealth depended on geography that became irrelevant. What we can't know is whether different choices could have prevented this. Could the Ottomans have adapted? Should they have seen it coming? The decline was slow, but inevitable. And the empire that rose from trade would spend the next 3 centuries trying to survive its loss. The Ottoman Empire continued for another 235 years after losing trade dominance, finally collapsing in 1922, after World War I. During this period, they shifted from being an economic superpower to being called the sick man of Europe, a phrase European powers used to describe their weakness. Ottoman GDP per capita stagnated, while European economies grew rapidly. By 1820, Ottoman per capita income was roughly 1/3 of Western European levels, a reversal from 1500, when they were wealthier. This gap widened throughout the 19th century. Loss of economic power directly led to military weakness. The empire couldn't afford to modernize its army while European powers industrialized their militaries. They lost territories progressively. Greece in 1832, Egypt in 1882, the Balkans between 1878 and 1913. Each loss reduced revenue further, creating a death spiral. Some historians argue that if the Ottomans had industrialized in the 18th century, they might have survived as a modern state. They had the population, natural resources, and strategic location. But they lacked the institutional structure that enabled European industrialization, property rights, capital markets, and decentralized innovation. If ocean navigation had never improved, if the Portuguese expeditions had failed, the Ottoman trade monopoly might have lasted centuries longer. But this seems unlikely. Once the basic technology existed, someone would have found the route eventually. The empire's decline wasn't about one explorer's luck. It was about inevitable technological progress. The Ottoman Empire's rise and fall shows us something timeless about wealth and power. What makes you rich today can make you obsolete tomorrow. The same trade routes that filled their treasuries for 2 centuries became their prison when the world found another way. Control is temporary. Creation endures. And no monopoly survives innovation forever.